He had shelved his retirement plans and continued working as a consultant for one of the world's largest real estate firms. Because he was alone, and free time is the enemy of an aging heart. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Emily, David's ex-wife. They hadn't spoken in a long time. She and his son David had divorced, and Walter had kept his distance to preserve what remained of the peace. But that morning, Emily's voice shattered every equilibrium he had left. Walter, what is it, Emily? He asked. Silence, only a few seconds, but to Walter it lasted a lifetime. David, last night, in an accident. What? We lost him. The teacup slipped from his hand and crashed to the floor, but Walter didn't even hear the glass shatter. It was as if every sound in the house, every breath, every creak, stopped at once. The blood drained from his face as if his own body refused to acknowledge what he had just heard. No, no, please say that again, he pleaded. But Emily didn't, because there was no need. The truth was no longer in the phone. It was a fissure at the center of his chest. The funeral, Saturday. I know you and David haven't been close lately, but he was your son. Walter could not respond. He simply lowered his head, as if Emily could somehow see him. In that instant, something inside him broke. A father had been invited to his child's funeral, but it was no invitation. It was a reckoning. The call ended. Walter slumped back into his chair. Among the shards of broken glass on the floor, a single tear slipped from his eye. It was not the first thing to fall that morning, but it was by far the heaviest. Walter remained seated in the same chair, the phone still in his hand. His gaze settled on the jagged fragments of glass at his feet, but his mind was lodged in a different crack. Memories of David's childhood, the first time he learned to ride a bike, the moment he whispered, "I love you, Dad," for the very first time. Then the phone rang again. This time the screen read, Greg, CEO, Archway Capital. His boss. Walter didn't want to answer, but his fingers betrayed him and tapped the screen out of habit. Even grief could not entirely override old routines. Walter, good. You picked up. I'll cut right to it. Remember that land deal in Dubai? Walter swallowed, his eyes still fixed on the floor. Yes, I remember. Your offer was approved. We have a 48-hour window and the buyer specifically wants you. The meeting is Saturday. Saturday, David's funeral. Silence clouded Walter's mind, but then Greg's voice filled even that void. Walter, this deal will net us $1 million in profit. Your involvement is what seals this contract. You just have to go, handle it, and come back. I'm sure David would want you to stay strong. There it was, the coldest sentence in the world. I'm sure David would want you to stay strong. That was the corporate equivalent of telling a man not to attend his son's funeral. In exchange for $1 million, a father would have to turn his back on his son's final farewell. Walter swallowed again. There was a knot in his throat, a furnace of anger in his chest, and a paralysis of his tongue. I need your answer by today, Greg said. This could be the grand finale of your career. Think of it as a legacy. A legacy. In that instant, Walter's eyes filled with tears, not for David, but for the system that offered humanity as a mere transactional option. When he hung up the phone, he had not made a decision. But he knew one thing. This deal was not merely about money or prestige. It was about honor. Walter wandered the rooms of his house in silence. He did not seem to be searching for anything, nor running from anything. He was simply attempting to make sense of the emptiness that now filled him. He approached the old bookshelf in the corner of the living room and pulled a dusty box from the bottom shelf. Inside were David's first birthday card, a copy of his college diploma, a childhood drawing pad, and an unwritten father-son letter. Walter had intended to write that letter years ago, but the words would never flow through his fingertips, because Walter himself had not been raised with words. And sadly, he had never learned to express love with them either. When David was a child, he would run to his mother for goodnight hugs, while Walter would simply nod to say goodnight before retreating from the moment. When David learned to ride his bike, Walter just watched from the window. When David fell and skinned his knee, Walter's only words were, Be more careful next time. Walter had grown accustomed to withholding affection, believing closeness to be a form of weakness. As David grew older, that silence became a wall. By the time David left for college, the distance between them was more than physical. Each Christmas, they exchanged only 3 words. Welcome home. I'm fine. Goodbye. In that moment, Walter realized they had never argued because they had never had a dialogue. He remembered the Christmas they never even took a single photo together. David sat in the living room alone, and Walter opted to go to bed. Loneliness was the only inheritance they ever shared. What they shared was not love, but a habit of silently losing each other. With a heavy sigh, Walter closed the box. He swallowed hard. I never said I love you, he whispered to the empty room. The words sounded foreign, even to his own ears, but it was too late. His son's gravestone would never hear them. Walter now understood. This silence could never be undone. When Walter returned to the kitchen table, he found 2 things on its surface: Greg's contract, the formal paperwork for the Dubai deal, and the funeral information Emily had left on his phone. A contract and a casket, both scheduled for the same day at the same hour. One represented a lifetime of professional esteem. The other was his son's last farewell, an opportunity he no longer had. Walter did not touch either document for a long time. He only stared at them. But his eyes were not on the papers themselves. They were back in the past. $1 million was no small sum. As Greg had said, think of it as your legacy. But what legacy? He thought. I could leave something behind for David. Something I never told him. I could fund scholarships, establish charitable projects in his name. That thought whispered to him like a conscience trying to trick him. Go to the deal. Do it for David. But another voice answered, from deeper down, cracked but honest. You cannot build anything in his name if you are not there at his grave. Walter pressed his hands to his temples. He had made 100 decisions in his life, hundreds of negotiations, countless investments. But none of those decisions had felt this personal, this quietly lethal. Then his phone buzzed once more. Greg. What have you decided, Walter? They're scheduling your jet. Walter took a deep breath, and his voice was slow but certain. I don't know yet. Greg fell silent for a moment. In that silence lay disappointment. Walter thought how distant the voice on the line was from his son's voice. That thought cut him like a blade. He reached for the contract. His fingers caught on the paper's sharp edge. He did not sign it. He only asked himself, which will cost me more, going or staying? When dawn's first light crept through the curtains, Walter was still seated in that same chair. He had made a decision, though he had not announced it. He picked up his phone and read Emily's last text. Funeral is at 11 o'clock. David would be happy if you came, and so would I. His fingers trembled as he typed, Emily, I'm sorry. I'm not feeling well. I can't come. He hesitated a moment before hitting send, then lifted his head to stare at the empty space before him. I'm not feeling well was perhaps the most honest lie he had ever told, because he was not sick. But the grief inside him was of a kind no doctor could heal. Walter hit send anyway. He rose, stepped over the shards of broken glass, and went to his closet. He pulled out a suitcase and began to pack. Clothes, toothbrush, a few pairs of socks. He didn't choose a suit. He chose a gray linen shirt, black trousers, and a simple jacket. Proper, but not funeral attire, because where he was going, no one would be mourning. Numbers would be spoken. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a childhood photo of David. In it, a beaming toddler wrapped his arms around Walter's neck. This is my last chance to say goodbye, he murmured. But I will say goodbye another way. Maybe through a memorial, maybe a foundation in his name, or by never fully forgiving myself. Time was against him. It was 8:47 a.m., and his flight departed at 10:20. The funeral began at 11 a.m. When Walter looked in the mirror, the wrinkles on his face told not only of age, but of regret. On that morning, regret was the one thing he could not fit into his suitcase. He closed the door behind him. Walking down the silent street, he did not hear funeral bells. He heard instead the tolling of his own conscience. While his son was being laid to rest, the father would be seated at $1 million table. On the drive to the airport, Walter gripped the steering wheel with both hands. The radio was off. His phone was silent. Only the rhythmic hum of the engine and the blur of asphalt lines beneath him accompanied him. The navigation app did not speak, just like the familiar silence inside him. An emptiness. At 9:05 a.m., he could still make the plane. He could still make the meeting. But his mind was nowhere. David's funeral, yes, it was an unfinished sentence spinning in his head. But he had also left that behind. Passing a gas station, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror and glimpsed a face he did not recognize. Neither pain nor fury, only exhaustion. He realized that for years he had lived by right choices, the right college, the right job, the right marriage, the right promotions. But his single greatest mistake had been failing to be the father David deserved. And now that error had no rectification. A wispy morning mist obscured the road ahead. In that haze beyond the pavement lines, he saw David as a boy. The morning Walter had dropped him off at kindergarten, a line of children holding their mother's hands only to be swallowed by that line on the way in, and David looking back at Walter, nodding silently. In that moment, Walter understood. He had mistaken distance for respect. In truth, it was just escape. It was 9:37. The signs pointed to the airport. Walter did not signal. He did not turn the wheel. He eased off the accelerator and pulled onto the shoulder. He killed the engine but kept his hands on the steering wheel. He drew a deep breath, then uttered as if to himself, "No job, no funeral. Today I will face everything I have lost." Tears welled, but this was not a cry of despair. This was resolve. He unpacked his suitcase, took it out and set it by the passenger seat. But he did not go anywhere. He sat on the shoulder, took out his phone, and canceled the flight. That night, far from the highway, Walter checked into an old roadside motel in a small town. The lobby clerk did not recognize him. And that was just how Walter wanted it. He didn't want to be seen as a father, a businessman, or a successful man. He simply wanted to be a man, broken, diminished, and long overdue. The little room was modest but clean. A desk, a single bed, a thin curtained window, and a kettle in the corner. He dropped his backpack on the bed, but he did not look in the mirror. He did not have the strength to face his own face. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small envelope. It contained old photographs Emily had sent years ago. David as a baby, at school ceremonies, on his 17th birthday. Each image magnified the emptiness inside him. Then he took something else from a zipped pocket, an old tape recorder, gray and yellowed with age. It was a cassette David had recorded when he was 6. Walter's hands shook as he pressed play. "Dad, if you're hearing this, it means it worked. When I grow up, I will always love you, okay? But you have to be proud of me. We're going to Dinosaur Park, I promise." The tape clicked off. In the silent room, not only David's childhood laughter remained, but Everett's broken heart echoed as well. Walter buried his head in his hands and knelt on the bed. For the first time, words came out without getting stuck in his throat. "I never told you I was proud of you, David, but you always loved me, even when I didn't deserve it." That night, Walter did not go to the meeting, nor did he return to the funeral. He sat alone with the fractured pieces of his past. He buried himself, not as a father, but as the father he ought to have been. When dawn's first rays slipped through the curtains, Walter was still awake. He had not slept. His mind would not quiet. His heart would not rest. David's voice lingered insistently in his ear. "Be proud of me." At 8:10 a.m., he descended to the lobby for coffee. His eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders slumped, but there was an awkward brightness to his expression, perhaps the timid sunrise of a new day. Behind the desk was a young clerk, whose name tag read Miguel. "Good morning, Mr. Hughes. Did you get any sleep?" Miguel asked kindly. Walter nodded, lying. Miguel seemed to sense it. He offered Walter a cup of coffee, then surprised him. "I lost my father last year, too," Miguel confessed, pouring the coffee. "We hadn't spoken for a year before he died." Walter looked up, truly meeting Miguel's eyes for the first time. It was as if something cracked open in that moment. Miguel went on to tell him about the conflict with his own father, the hollow ache of not saying goodbye, and how, in time, he learned to accept him as he was. Walter remained silent, but his expression began to dissolve, as if Miguel's words exhumed emotions Walter had buried for years. Then, almost as if out of nowhere, Walter's lips trembled. "I should have been at my son's funeral yesterday," he said, "but I chose not to go." Miguel said nothing. He neither judged nor looked away. He simply nodded. And then as Walter's tears fell, for the first time in years, it was not tears of shame, but of release, for the control he had clung to was slipping away. "I never told him I loved him," Walter whispered. "Not once. But he loved me, even when I didn't deserve it." Miguel set down his coffee cup on the desk and spoke a single sentence. "Sometimes being loved can still save you." At that moment, Walter realized he was talking, truly talking for the first time in a long while. And perhaps, in the presence of a stranger that morning, he felt for the first time that he could be forgiven. At exactly 10:42 a.m., Walter sat in the small motel lounge, finishing the last of his coffee. Miguel was tidying up, occasionally glancing at him, as though waiting for something. Maybe for Walter to finish confronting himself. Just then, his phone buzzed. Greg. Walter looked at the phone, then turned away to gaze out the window. Yet the phone still buzzed, no place left to hide. He answered. "Walter, the delegation from Dubai has arrived. We're setting up the conference room now. Everything is on schedule. 2 o'clock. Where will you be?" Greg's voice was as familiar as old leather, but empty of warmth. Walter, still looking out the window, did not reply. Finally, he lowered the phone from his ear. "This deal is no longer mine," he said quietly. Silence. Then Greg snapped, "What do you mean it's not yours? You spent your whole life building this deal. Are you insane?" Walter swallowed, his tone calm but unwavering. "Greg, I've invested in a lot of the wrong things. My job, my office, the numbers. But I never invested in my son. And now he's gone." Greg was silent. In that sentence, there was a hollow space, the same void everyone felt inside. "Listen, I know what you're going through, but all that effort can't just—" Walter shook his head slightly. It was not a mere refusal. It was a declaration of liberation. It will not go to waste, because I have something else now." "What's that?" Greg spat. "My conscience." Walter hung up. He did not hurl curses at the phone, did not offer explanations, for there were no words left to say within those office walls. He reached into his pocket, found his old brown notebook marked "Fatherhood File, My Failures," and sat back down. He gazed out at the small town beyond the window. The church bells rang precisely at 11:03 a.m. The air inside the chapel was heavy with tears, the scent of flowers, and all the words that had gone unsaid. David's funeral was underway. Emily, in a black dress, was seated in the front row, her head bowed. Beside her were a few family friends, old schoolmates, colleagues, some neighbors. Everybody was there. Everyone except one person. In the very front row, where Walter should have been, was an empty chair. His place, his invitation to stand. Except it wasn't an invitation. It was a void that spoke louder than any eulogy. As the priest began his ceremonial opening prayers, Emily lifted her head, a mixture of longing and resignation on her face. That morning's text from Walter, "I'm not feeling well," still glowed on her phone, because no matter how deeply it wounded her, she maintained a faint hope that he might yet arrive. He did not. David's casket, surrounded by white lilies, occupied the center of the altar. On top of the casket was a small framed photo of David as a child. Missing teeth, a mop of untamed hair, a grin that lit up the world. The one who should have stood next to him was nowhere to be found. Whispers rose around Emily. Why hasn't his father come? Was his job more important? He couldn't even come to his own son's funeral? Emily heard the whispers but said nothing, not even to herself, because she did not know the answer either. Maybe Walter still saw David as a perpetual child. Maybe he believed he could make amends later. Or maybe he had only ever known how to run away. Whatever the reason, at her son's final farewell, one seat remained empty. That void did not just exist in a chair, but echoed through the very heart of the casket. As the ceremony continued, the priest spoke of David's good nature, his unfulfilled dreams, and the sorrow of his early passing. At one point he paused. "We all gather here today because some chose to be with David at this moment. Others chose different paths. But no matter what, David's love is here among us." Emily bowed her head. A single tear fell to the floor. But then her gaze drifted to that empty seat, and she whispered to herself, "I cannot forgive him. But maybe David did. My son never lacked for love, no matter how fatherless he was." The morning after the funeral, Walter sat alone in his motel room. His suitcase remained closed. His phone was silent. Time, it seemed, had stopped for him. Then there was a knock at the door. A clerk from the front desk stood there holding an envelope. "Mr. Hughes, you have a delivery sent by Emily Carter." Walter furrowed his brow, thanked her, and closed the door behind her. On the envelope, in Emily's unmistakable handwriting, were three simple words: David's last request. Walter's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a notarized document. The heading read, "Last Will and Testament of David James Hughes." Dated 3 months ago. Walter's eyes scanned the lines. With each sentence, his heart grew heavier. "If you are reading this, Dad, I probably won't be here. I'm not sure when the last time we truly spoke was. Maybe you don't remember either. But that doesn't mean I didn't love you. You never told me you were proud of me. I understand now that you had your own battles. If I die, I leave my home to you. Yes, to the man who never once held me. Because when I left that house, I felt alone. Maybe now, you can enter and say goodbye." Walter pressed the letter to his chest and sank onto the bed. David had not forgiven him, but he had not hated him either. "Leave my home to you," he had written. Not a fortune, but a chance to say farewell. It was the greatest gift he could have left, and the greatest punishment, because opening a house door would be easy. Crossing that threshold would carry the weight of a lifetime. Walter lifted his head. He imagined hearing David's voice again. "Say goodbye. This time, don't run away." The next morning, the sun struggled through the clouds. Walter buttoned his black jacket and made his way toward David's gravesite. He counted his footsteps as though each one was a sentence of apology. The cemetery was silent. Even the birds seemed to mourn. Walter stood in front of the polished white marble headstone, DAVIDJAMESHUGHES, 1989 to 2024. Beloved, missed. For the first time, he read the dates of his son's birth and death side by side. How strange it was to fit a whole life into those 2 lines. He drew a crumpled note from his pocket and read the words he hadn't yet written, the words he'd carry in his heart. "Hello, son. There are things I should have told you long ago, but I never did because I kept running. I was never there." He inhaled a slow, quavering breath, feeling weight inside him, yet sensing for the first time that he could breathe. "When you cried, I did not hear you. When you grew up, I wasn't by your side. But every night I thought of you. I never said I loved you, because I didn't know how. But you taught me love's meaning. Even if you left, you are still teaching me." The ground remained still, but as Walter spoke, a warm breeze brushed against him, as though someone else were listening. He rose and looked at the headstone one last time, before placing his note in his jacket pocket. He sat on a bench next to the grave. He did not cry. This time, tears would not bury the past. Words would, because he had just bidden farewell not to a corpse, but to his own guilt. When Walter returned to the town after leaving the cemetery, the sun had broken through the clouds. The air was still cold, but inside him there was a gentle warmth. That late-night conversation with David had not completely healed him, but it had loosened the first knot. He went back to the motel to retrieve a letter Emily had sent. At the front desk, the same clerk handed him an envelope. "Mr. Hughes, this for you, from Emily Carter." Walter's throat tightened as he took it. He didn't open it there. He went to his room and placed the envelope on the table, pouring himself water instead of coffee. This time he needed to remain clear-headed and calm. The envelope was worn at the edges, as if it had been waiting a long time in a drawer. He gently peeled it open and removed a yellowed page dated 3 weeks earlier, only days after David's death. Walter's hands shook as he began to read. Dad, I'm not sure if I still expect anything from you as I write this, but I know some things have to be said, or they remain buried in our souls. We always had this gap between us, a void created by silence rather than words. But I tried to understand you. You were flawed and you fell short, but you were not heartless. Maybe you were scared, scared of being vulnerable, scared of connecting, scared of responsibility. I forgive you, Dad, not because you deserved it, but because I could not allow my own heart to be poisoned. And if you ever read this, know that I loved you. I never said it, but every child wants to say still to a father who seems so far away. So I say, still, I am your son. As Walter finished reading, tears streamed down his face. They were tears of hope and relief, because in those words David had filled the spaces between them. He pressed the letter to his chest. He could not reply, but a whisper escaped his lips. I always loved you too, David, but I learned too late how to show it. He folded the letter and placed it into his notebook, which now felt complete. Its final missing sentence had been filled by David's own voice. A few months later, Walter Hughes no longer roamed the high-rise offices nor attended endless meetings. His cell phone remained silent. He only turned it on to show his grandson a drawing from time to time. Instead, he spent his mornings walking through a nearby park with his brown notebook in his pocket, jotting down brief thoughts. The breeze today sounded like David's laughter. When children play, time truly stops. Such notes were worth no millions, and yet to Walter they held more value than any of his old business deals. One day he received a request for an interview. A journalist wanted to write a piece titled, "The Man Who Walked Away from a Major Deal." Walter agreed on one condition. Do not speak of money. I chose something else. Truth. The journalist was surprised. What truth do you mean? Walter replied without hesitation. Truth is accepting what you missed and knowing it's not too late to make it right. I didn't go to my son's funeral, but in the end, I spoke with him. I honored his dream, and for the first time, I walked beside him rather than running away. The journalist fell silent for a moment, then jotted down a single line for his notes. The man didn't change when he lost his son. He changed when he finally sought to understand him. After that interview, Walter returned home. As he walked in the door, he heard a small voice. Grandpa, does this robot look like Uncle David? He smiled, lowered himself to his grandson's level, and said, Yes, but he's a bit quieter than you. Amid laughter, he thought, this was my choice. Not money, not regret, but what was humane. In that moment, his brown notebook was finally closed, its story complete. Walter Hughes had once been a man defined by corporate rules, but he learned, however late, that true strength lies in knowing when to let go. And so he made his choice. Not what was expected, but what was right. It only arrived late, but it was the right decision. What was humane?